Hey everybody, I'm Tommy, and today I'm going to show you how I made these jointer push grips where one of them has these little pegs that drop down and help you finish pushing your board through the jointer. Whether it's your first time here or even if you've been here before, welcome to 1 Minute Workbench. So the push grips that came with my jointer are pretty good. However, I find that sometimes when I'm face jointing a board, they start to slip, especially when it comes to the end of the cut. So I often just use my hands because I can get a better grip with my hands. And a viewer sent me an email suggesting that I find a safer alternative, and that's what led me to this design with these little pegs. I started by cutting out rectangles that will make up the main shapes of the push grips. I used 1/2-inch plywood, but you could use a variety of different materials for a project like this. So with my stacks of rectangles, you can already see the basic shape the grips will have. These pieces I'm laminating are going to be the handles. I'm doubling them up so the handles will be a little thicker and more comfortable to hold. After those had a chance to dry, I started making all of the marks I would need. I made marks for a series of holes that would allow the drop-down pegs to work, and then I drew out the shape of the handles. An adjustable square works great for drawing lines at a consistent dimension like this. And anything that's perfectly round, like this brass marking gauge, can be used to trace rounded shapes in the corners. I drilled a couple of counter bores about 2/3 of the way through one of the main plates, and matching counter bores in a piece that will work as the cover for the pegs. I then drilled one more piece with the same size holes, except this time they went all the way through. I drilled holes that are just larger than the pegs the rest of the way through the main plate. These two small pieces are what's actually going to hold the pegs in place. I used a bandsaw to cut out the shapes for the handles, but if you don't have a bandsaw, you could make these same cuts with a jigsaw or a coping saw. You'll just need to go slow and be careful to follow your line. Using a disc sander, I very carefully rounded the small pieces that will hold the pegs in place. I also rounded all the sharp corners and smoothed out the bandsaw cuts. To ensure the pegs would operate smoothly, I used a round file to remove any burrs from the inside edges of the holes that contain the pegs. I did a dry assembly of the components and marked the pegs so that they could be cut down to the appropriate length. They were looking good, so I added some glue. While those were drying, I rounded over the edges of the handles using my DIY vise-mounted router table. Before building this router table, I would usually round over the edges using an orbital sander and a file. And now I'm wondering why I ever waited so long to build this thing. If you haven't seen the video for this router table, be sure to check it out. The pegs were actually still just a bit too long, so I used the sander to take off the extra length. And with the speed of the sander turned way down, I very carefully smoothed out the shape and rounded the sharp edges. With all the internal holes free of burrs and the pegs being perfectly smooth, The drop-down action of the pegs was on point. I added some glue and made sure the holes were perfectly aligned inside. When adding the cover over the pegs, since I couldn't see inside, I just did my best to make sure they were aligned in a way that wouldn't interfere with the movement of the pegs. I also wiped the glue back from the inside edges of the holes in an effort to keep the squeeze out from making its way inside. After the assembly had some time to dry, I finished adding the outside contours with the disc sander. I rounded the inside edges using a flat file. And finally, I rounded the top edges using the router table. I used my marking gauge to center the handle and then drew some alignment lines. To attach the handles, I thought about using screws, but eventually decided to use dowels. This is just in case these grips ever come in contact with the jointer's knives. If that happens, I wanted to make sure it wouldn't be a catastrophe. I then repeated the process for the other push grip. Once they were dry, I gave everything a good sanding just to help prep for finishing. I used a scrap bicycle inner tube to create the grippy bottom surface. The inside of these inner tubes are coated with powder, so I washed them very thoroughly. After washing, I checked to see which surface provided more grip. The outside surface is very grippy, while the inside surface doesn't actually provide much grip at all. That said, I decided to use the outside surface for making contact with boards that are being jointed, and I used 60 grit sandpaper to rough up the smooth inside surface so it could be glued to the push grips. I mixed up some 2-part epoxy and used it to attach the rubber to the push grips, but I'm actually going to recommend that you use regular old super glue, and you'll see why a little bit later on in this video. I did the same thing for the grip that has the pegs, except I used masking tape to block the pegs so epoxy couldn't get inside. After the epoxy cured, I removed all the clamps and trimmed away the excess rubber using a razor knife. I used a hole punch to make a hole in the rubber just over each of the pegs. I then applied 6 coats of satin water-based polyurethane and sanded in between each coat. I gave the push grips their first test on a board that was probably a bit too long for my jointer, and these grips worked beautifully. They felt way more substantial than my other grips, and I was able to control this oversized board with ease. I did notice, however, after just a few test cuts, that some of the rubber was coming loose at the corners. That's when I decided it was time to do a test with a few different types of adhesives and see if I could get a better result. I did a test with some hot melt glue and some super glue. Now, I didn't prep the surface with sandpaper this time, and I only let them cure for about 5 minutes. The piece attached with hot melt glue came loose very easily, But I did notice that the edge of that piece got into the super glue and it put up a good fight. And for the piece that I attached with super glue, the face came loose easily, but the edges were very well attached. I actually opened up the camera view here so you could see how much force I had to apply in order to get the edges to break free. So I did another test where I did use sandpaper on the face of the rubber, and I let the super glue cure for about an hour. The piece was so hard to break free that I eventually just gave up. After that, I went back and reinforced all the corners with super glue, and since then, they've showed no signs of budging at all. If I were to do this project again, I would skip the epoxy altogether and go straight to the super glue. I'm really happy I made these push grips. As I mentioned before, they feel very substantial, and they just give me such better control when jointing a board. And they're a huge step up from the cheap plastic ones that came with the jointer. Hey, thanks for watching. I really hope you liked this video. If you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe, and make sure you hit the bell icon. That way you get notified every time there's a new episode. I'd love to hear what you think of these push grips in the comments section below. And if you have any quick questions you want answered, hit me up on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. And until the next time I see you, I hope you have fun building something.